Okay, so today we're going to talk about something a little bit different, but not all that different. Let's see if we can bring up this from then to now, how we got where we are. So here's one of the things I tell my younger students, and this is in one of my books. If you understand the ancient Greeks, you know almost everything you need to know about politics because the stuff they were talking about almost 3,000 years ago is pretty much the same stuff that we are talking about today. And what they said sort of sums up the kinds of conflicts that we face now. So it all starts with this guy, Socrates, and he was, as you can tell, born in the Stone Age when everyone was made of stone. As with a lot of these people, we don't really know what they look like, and he was a real person, and like a number of people involved in the area of political philosophy and related fields, he didn't write anything down. He was a stonemason. He served in the Athenian army with distinction. That was one of the requirements, was that able-bodied male citizens had to serve in the army. And Athens was the premier city of Greece, and Greece was this collection of literally hundreds of small city states. So as though, Seattle and Tacoma and Federal Way and Des Moines were all independent governments, and they had a common language, and they had a common religion, a little different than anything that we see today. I've never been able to quite figure out. I think it was more about ritual and whatnot than it was about sort of comfort in the way we might think of faith today. But in any case, Athens was sort of a democracy. So all the free males got to vote, but they did elect some councils before, above them, who would make some decisions. And if things went really sideways, they might appoint what they referred to as a tyrant, which at that point meant that somebody simply was in charge in times of crisis. It didn't have quite the same meaning that it has for us. So Athens was sort of everything that was right and wrong with democracy, a broader level of participation. Athens was a big city, a few 100,000 people, as I recall, although as many of 2/3 of them were slaves, and women did not get to participate in politics in a meaningful way at that point. Slavery in the ancient world wasn't quite like it was in the 19th century in this country. Slaves could own businesses, they could buy their own freedom. There was no stigma attached if you had to been a slave. So the Greeks didn't like to work, that was sure. But one thing that was really important to them was politics. Politics was like NASCAR and wrestling and golf and everything all wrapped into one. Our word idiot derives from the Greek word idiotes, which means someone who is not interested in politics. So they thought this was very important. There were philosophers before this, and they might have said interesting things, but one of the unfortunate things is that only fragments of their work remains. So really, when we get to Socrates, who, like I said, didn't write anything down, he's the first person that we really actually know something about. Socrates sort of created a foundation for political philosophy, and political philosophy, political theory matters because this is what informs a lot of what we do now, and we'll see that as we go along here. So the Socratic method, of course, was to ask questions. And Socrates' point was that if you asked enough questions, you might get to something near the truth. So So here we have this Athenian government. There's a painting of the Parthenon. It's still there, and Athens became rich. They discovered a vein of silver. They got sort of too big for their britches. They began to veer toward an empire. There was a struggle between sort of the agrarian interests and the commercial interests, and the commercial interests wanted colonies and territories and needed a big navy, and so they won out, and Athens attempted to conquer Syracuse and the island of Sicily, and sort of dominated the rest of Greece until the other Greeks got together and sort of put them back in their place. So when Socrates is alive, this war, the Peloponnesian War, after the peninsula where Athens is located, meant that the democratic forces were out of power and sort of the aristocratic forces were in power. And the thing about this form of democracy that Athens had was that you could get voted out of town. And this was sort of, this gets to the challenge of real democracy, which is people having a rule. I stress to my students, my younger students, we don't live in a democracy. Everyone says that, right? Oh, this is a democracy. No, it's not. It's a republic. We elect people to make decisions on our behalf. Now, of course, there are trade-offs involved here, but the thing about democracy was that the Athenians would have these elections, and demagogues, people who sort of promised the moon and didn't deliver anything except to themselves, would sway the public, and they would vote people off. This is an ostraka, and our word ostracize comes from this. They would have these elections, and people would write names of the people in government they didn't like on these shards of pottery, and then they would count them up, and if you got enough votes, they kicked you out of town. And this happened. They got rid of perfectly good leaders because demagogues would come along and say all kinds of terrible things, and people believed this. This is a problem to this day wherever there is direct democracy. So one of the things that I always refer to is the initiative process in Washington state, which is indeed direct democracy. So in a couple of years in a row in our state, for example, via initiative, we voted to reduce class size and raise teachers' salaries, and then we voted to cut taxes. This makes no sense, right? You voted to increase spending and then you voted to cut taxes. That's like buying a car and quitting your job. But this is the challenge. The good part is people get to participate. The bad part is that people aren't always paying attention. We adopted 3 strikes, you're out. It was pushed by the private prison industry. In no state where 3 strikes, you're out has been adopted has the crime rate gone down faster than in states that didn't. So people can get carried away. So one of the reasons we know anything about Socrates is his student Plato. So Socrates was a stonemason. His father had been a stonemason. Then eventually he just became a teacher. He said he wouldn't take any money. One of the sources, there's a couple other writers of the time who talked about Socrates, and one of them says, yeah, he got paid. Doesn't really matter. In any case, Plato is really quite interesting, I think. Plato says, look, democracy doesn't work, because one of the things that happened was that his beloved teacher Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the morals of the youth, etc., and was convicted and was forced to commit suicide. So Plato says, here, look, the greatest guy I know who really didn't do anything wrong, because he was unpopular in some circles when the democratic forces took power again, had to kill himself. And so Plato works through. You're lucky you don't have to read Plato. He wrote in dialogues, right? And they're just paragraphs. You sort of have to figure out who's talking. There are no quotation marks. And most of the existing translations of Plato were written by old Brits. And while old Brits are wonderful people too, some of them were very, very wordy. And so it's not great prose at this point. And the dialogue form, which would have been very familiar to Plato's readers, is difficult for us. So, but in any case, he works through in the Republic in some detail as this discussion between all these people, including Socrates. So, who knows if Socrates would have agreed with this? Plato uses him as his mouthpiece. And he says, what is justice? And they go around and round and they talk about what people think justice is. And ultimately, Plato, through Socrates, says, justice is having people do the thing for which they are best suited. And so from this, he constructs a system of government. And he says, look, you want the best soldiers being soldiers and the best shoemakers being shoemakers. Why not have the people who are most suited to govern? And he develops a whole system for this, which makes him unlike almost anyone else who wrote about this. He says, we will have a guardian class, and anyone can apply, men and women, and their needs will be taken care of. So they won't be greedy, and they won't run the state just for the point of view of their personal benefit. And they will work for some years, and they will study, and those who sort of survive all this, who will be the people, and they will be put in power. And this may sound crazy, but this is pretty much what the medieval Catholic Church looked like. This is what the old Soviet Union looked like. You had a ruling class, and they were educated and advanced to this position. Of course, human nature being what it is, this didn't end greed, and it didn't end a lust for power. And ultimately, in both instances, the state, in effect, operated for its own interests as opposed to the interests of the people. Now, what makes this even more interesting to me, I think, is that one of Plato's students was this guy, Aristotle. And he is a much better read. He is, has been described, befitting his name, a severely aristocratic approach, right? When you read Aristotle, he's not real wild about the common people, but he's very practical. He's really considered the father of political science because he studied, all these different forms of government in Greece and elsewhere, and sort of works through the logic of what government might be like. And Aristotle says of his teacher's plan, Plato, if this is so good, why hasn't anybody tried it? And he says, look, there are sort of three basic forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, he calls it. And he says those would be ideal. Like Plato. Now, my younger students always get confused about this. Plato said, and Aristotle after him also says, in theory, the best possible form of government would be a philosopher king, someone who is strong enough to protect the state and the people, but also someone who is just enough not to oppress them. And they agree on this one thing. But then both of them say, this is, in fact, the worst possible form of government, because you almost never find somebody who's sort of tough enough to do the job, but kind enough not to hurt people. If we were to look, for example, at the history of the kings of England until, Parliament really took over the government, you kind of went back and forth between nice guys who were terrible kings and really mean guys who were good kings, but not good to people. So it's very hard to find both of these things. We see this in business. It's pretty rare to have a CEO who's sort of tough enough to get stuff done, but good enough to the employees, or smart enough to start a firm, but not smart enough to run it. So it's a difficult thing. So Aristotle says, look, any of these forms of government would work. Monarchy would be fine if you have a good king, but monarchy, he says, tends to turn into tyranny, and he meant it the way we meant it. Someone with all the power will ultimately start doing bad things to people. Aristocracy, rule by the best, he says, that would be great, except it tends to turn into oligarchy, which is sort of rule by the greedy and the rapacious. And then he says, Polity would be fine. You could put the people in charge, but it tends to turn into democracy, which to him and other ancient Greeks meant rule by the mob. And this continued, right? To the founding fathers of this country, democracy was not a good word. They thought of it in the way that the Greeks thought of it, that it would be ruled by the mob. And that's why the party of Jefferson called themselves Republicans. Unlike so many textbooks, they never called themselves Democratic Republicans. They called themselves Republicans because democracy to them was not a good idea. So Aristotle, and this idea should sound familiar, says, since each of these has an ideal form, but it tends to devolve into its bad form, why don't we mix them up and have elements of each governing the state? And he says, even the common people who aren't that smart, collectively, all of us will be smarter together. So he's really the person who starts this idea of what we think of as checks and balances. So you can see there, I hope that you understand what these guys say. These are the same problems that we face today. It's, you watch episodes of any of the Star Trek series and they thaw somebody out from our time and they say, well, we've solved the problems of human greed and want and need and all that. It's like, that's ridiculous. If you recall, the internet was supposed to change how we live and what we do. And no, you get more interesting pictures of cats for the most part. So anyway, meanwhile, roughly the same time on the other side of the world, Confucius, who apparently also was made of stone, and once again, didn't write anything down. We don't really know what he looks like. This is the Latinized form of his name, which may have been Confuza. And he was like Socrates, sort of abandoned his children at one point, didn't take care of his family. This happens a lot with these guys. He was a public official in a Chinese state and apparently a good administrator and sort of turned around by various accounts. I mean, every story about him is different, but may have been sort of the minister of justice and reformed the police and made things work better. And then in a palace intrigue gets kicked out and ends up becoming this wandering teacher. And his disciples and people like another generation away wrote stuff down. What he appeared to believe was that you should have a monarchy, you should have a king who was powerful, but the king should be restrained by order and tradition and respect and ritual, and understanding that the benefit of his subjects was also to the benefit of him. This idea comes up again later. And of course, it doesn't ever seem to work. So once again, the idea of a philosopher king sounds wonderful, but it hardly ever happens. So the next thing we get to are the Romans, and the Romans conquered Greece, but remained in awe of them. Greek became the language of education and commerce for the Roman world. If you were smart, you also spoke Greek. And so the Romans created a government. This is a painting of what was supposed to be the Roman Senate. And the Romans had in their government more checks and balances than a really big bank branch. They had so many checks on power that increasingly it became difficult to get anything done. And they knew they needed reforms, but there were tribunes and consuls in the Senate and all these other assemblies, and everybody could check everybody else's power. And so nothing happened. Eventually, Augustus Caesar took over, became emperor. The Senate continued for hundreds of years, but it was powerless at that point. And so the Roman practice was interesting, but really it didn't work. And this speaks to one of the challenges that we face in government, is that government has to be strong enough to do something, but not so strong as to oppress its people. It's a very difficult balance. So what survived from the collapse of the Roman Empire, of course, was the Catholic Church, and which brings us to St. Augustine. So the question changes at this point because the church survives. The Roman Empire by 485 is gone. It's a bunch of competing different kingdoms. Charlemagne united Europe briefly, but it fell apart after he died. So St. Augustine was a convert. And as you may have noted, people who convert to one faith or another tend to be more devout than other people. So Augustine is the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. He's dying. The city's under siege. And he writes a book called The City of God. And the question now has become, what is the relative authority of the church and the state? And that was something that drove the Romans nuts about Jews and Christians, was they put God above everyone else. And in the Roman world, everywhere the Romans conquered, they had a new set of gods. They were like, okay, bring them on. They just adopted everything. So the idea that someone owed their allegiance to God before they owed their allegiance to Caesar was something Romans couldn't quite wrap their heads around. St. Augustine says that the state is punishment for man's sins. He's like the least happy philosopher I've ever had to read. His world is falling apart. So that's kind of, where you stand depends upon where you sit. So Augustine says that there's a city of God and the city of man, and the city of man is wicked and wrong and evil and nasty, but you should still obey it. And he puts the church above everything else. And he sort of, other than some Muslim philosophers who in Spain basically worked through the same arguments again, the Muslims had access to the works of Aristotle, which were lost to the West at this point. And then as the Spaniards began to reconquer Spain, they reconquered Toledo, which had this big library, and they rediscovered Aristotle, which brings us to another happy, smiling guy, Thomas Aquinas. Here again, you should be glad that you never have to read him. Ermagerd, what happened? His book about politics consists of, on one page, he puts forth a bunch of ideas, and on the next page he refutes them. It's just like, Mother of God, just say what you mean here. It's just appalling. But in any case, he's much happier than Augustine, and he says begrudgingly that the earthly life matters a little bit too. And, he still thinks the church should be above everything else, but that it is possible to have a secular worldly government, and that's okay. So now, one of history's more misunderstood people, Machiavelli. If people have heard anything about Machiavelli, they think he is the devil incarnate. Except in Italy, where he's regarded as a national hero, and I'll tell you why. Machiavelli lived in Florence, which was the heart of the Renaissance, and in his lifetime, Italy was sort of the training ground for the armies of Europe, and the Spanish and the French and others kept marching through and destroying things. He was in government, so Florence was sort of a republic. It was basically an oligarchy, but they threw out the Medici, and for a brief period, it really was run as a republic, and he was sort of combination diplomat, foreign secretary, secretary of defense, and he's practical. He's very, very practical. And Machiavelli's sort of basic message was that, look, if your enemies aren't going to play fair, why should you? And so he prescribes in his work steps to be taken to sort of turn Italy into one defensible country. And this is why he's a hero in Italy. He says, look, this isn't working. We need to be able to take care of and defend ourselves. If people have read anything by Machiavelli, it's The Prince, in which he says some things that are sort of shocking to us, but made sense in his time. If you were to read his other major work, The Discourses, he's a Republican. He agrees with Aristotle. You should have a republic. You should have some balance in government. And he's sort of regarded as the first modern political philosopher. He doesn't even talk about religion. So here we've had 1,000 years of people arguing over church and state, and Machiavelli doesn't even go there. He just talks about the state. Now, This guy was not much of a political philosopher, but he let the genie out of the bottle. Martin Luther was a doctor of theology in Germany, and at the time, the Catholic Church was funding its wars and various other projects by selling indulgences. And so they sent these people around, mostly in Germany, but other places as well. And they said, if you give us enough money, we will guarantee that you get to heaven. And Luther watched this happen, and he said, my gosh, these people aren't that rich, and these people from Rome come and they shake them down with promises that they can't keep. And so Luther says, this isn't right. You don't have to be rich to get into heaven. You only have to have faith. By faith alone shall you be saved. And while he was not a Democrat or a Republican by any means, what happens here is that Luther is in essence saying we are all equal before God. Well, it's a short hop, skip, and a jump from there to saying we're all equal before the state. So while he probably didn't intend that, indeed, that was the practical effect. From that point forward, it became increasingly difficult to argue that citizens should have sort of different levels of respect. Now, Thomas Hobbes was really interesting. He was born in 1588. That was the year of the Spanish Armada. And the story about Hobbes is that his mother heard about the Armada coming and was so afraid she went into labor, and Hobbes was born. He lived a long time for his time. He was a big believer in physical fitness. He thought he was a mathematician and got in lots of arguments with people about math problems at which he was apparently not that good. He was the tutor to Charles II. So once again, we always have to consider what were these people living through. So Hobbes's time is the English Civil War. Charles I gets beheaded. The parliamentarians take over. Oliver Cromwell rules the country apparently reasonably well for about 10 years. He dies. They bring back Charles II. So what Hobbes is known for is he's the first guy to suggest that government is a contract between the ruler and the government. And while Hobbes favors a king, he thinks that the king should be restrained by his own self-interest. We've heard that before. It doesn't ever seem to work. It's not very long before Parliament asserts its authority ultimately. But he has an interesting turn of phrase. Hobbes posits a state of nature, which he calls a war of all against all. And this is how he justifies why we need a state. And he says, in this state, life is solitary, nasty, brutish, poor, and short. And it's a lovely turn of phrase, although it's an unhappy idea. But in any case, Hobbes leads to this guy, John Locke. And John Locke was also was a physician, and he was affiliated with the guy who became William, and of William and Mary fame. And so Charles Stuart II's brother James is thrown out, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And from that point forward, Parliament is in many ways running the country. Locke is famous for saying that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and property, which should sound very much like what Jefferson said. He thought property was going too far, so that's why he said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke was not sort of a balanced government guy. He thought Parliament should be in charge. And as we noted, it soon was. Like most of the people we're looking at, man, they all look so grim, you know. This guy gets mentioned a lot as a source of American government because he also talked about divisions of power within government. I just like him because his name is so damn long. I mean, that is just like, really? Did Did you leave anything out? Uh, uh, he was a French aristocrat, and his idea of a division of power included the king and nobles and common people and the church. So another sort of Swiss Frenchman who is kind of interesting. Now, what's notable about Rousseau, his is the first portrait with anything like a smile. And for the number of people that Rousseau spent intimate time with, I can imagine why he's smiling. Another guy who abandoned his children, moved from Switzerland to France, and wrote a lot. He's all over the map. Communists, anarchists, nationalists, I mean, pick an ism, many of them will say, oh, well, we got this from Rousseau, right? Because he's just all over. He is also a proponent of the social contract theory, that in fact the state is a contract between the governed and the governors. His particular ideas about government are sort of verging towards a small state, a low level of government. That makes him popular with a lot of people. He's a better read than some of these folks, be that as it may. Now, this guy's really interesting. So he was a an Irish-British member of parliament, considered the father of modern conservatism. And Burke is interesting. He supported the American Revolution, even though he was British. He said, look, we really should just let this go because they're going to make us richer than we could possibly imagine. On the other hand, he opposed the French Revolution. He said it was not based on constitutional principles. And of course, the French Revolution resulted in thousands of deaths, including a number of the revolutionaries by the time they were done. Burke is really interesting. When my younger students read him, they're like, oh, this guy's awful. But, and I don't agree with everything he says, but Burke says, look, you're born into a world that already exists. To some extent, you're an inheritor of those institutions. And Burke's argument is that the survival of human institutions suggests their value, right? That people have adopted these things because they work. Now, we have to only go as far as pointing at something like slavery and say, are you sure there, Ed? I'm not sure that's such a good institution. But in any case, Burke speaks towards preservation of what's there and change based only on what he calls constitutional principles. So usually when I was studying political philosophy, this guy gets totally overlooked. And Madison, who was kind of a president, but really was the chief architect of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And Madison was all of 5'4" and apparently had a high squeaky voice. As one historian said, Steven Seagal could not play James Madison, right? He's just a tiny squeaky little guy, but really smart. And had read all this stuff, right? Had read all these people who had come before him. And sometimes some of the stuff that he writes is sort of like, well, everyone knows what happened to the Amphictyon League. It's like, no, Jimmy, they probably don't. But Madison deals with the problem of our age, which is interest groups, really, I think, and or special interest groups if we disagree with them. And Madison understands that what happens with people with particular interests is that they become so obsessed with those interests, they lose sight of everything else, and they will take the government down. And we can all think of things that we might agree with, but, you know, we talk about gun rights or choice or any number of things. The people who really care about, that's all they care about. And that informs their voting and their political decision making. And Madison says, you know, that's not so good. So, but if we ban interest groups, right, we in effect limit the very freedom that we tried so hard to get in the first place. And so Madison's answer was, following Aristotle, Machiavelli, Montesquieu, all these guys, we will have a divided government, We will have power divided into different branches in this case, and also between the states and the national government. And we will so divide power that it will make it difficult for anybody to dominate the government on their own. And moreover, by just letting interest groups go, we will encourage them to compete and keep each other in check. And this is, to me, just a wonderfully practical approach, and rather remarkable that it's worked for so long. Does it always work? Oh, no. There are times throughout our country's history where one interest or another has just become way too dominant. But over time, those things tend to work themselves out, which is a small consolation if you're living through it at the moment. So really overlooked as a political philosopher, I think. Madison and to a lesser extent, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay wrote what are now called the Federalist Papers. And these were a series of newspaper articles encouraging people to vote to approve the Constitution. So during the debate over the Constitution, because the states had to ratify, they wrote this rather incredible set of articles, and they got rediscovered by some historian in the 50s. And now we think like this is the gospel here. So a very important political thinker, and especially in our country. Like I said, kind of an president, but a first-rate mind. Now, the next important guy. So when I deal with younger students, less so now, but generally speaking, John Stuart Mill is the guy that they sort of cotton on to the most because, well, he was a capitalist and he's in favor of freedom. He was early feminist. The first guy since Plato to really say, look, women deserve an equal chance at everything that men do. A very odd upbringing. His father, James Mill, was a political philosopher of some repute, and so he didn't have playmates, he had tutors. He could speak ancient Greek and Latin by the time he was 4. By some estimate, he has the highest IQ of anyone in history. He described himself as a young genius and an emotional hobby horse. He had to reinvent himself because he had not had a normal upbringing. But Mill is the father of what he calls utilitarianism, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. On the other hand, he was not sort of very progressive in terms of race, but he does speak to a higher level of freedom. Although later in his life, he was saying, capitalism isn't working all that well. I might be a socialist, but his early writing tends to attract young Americans. Anyway, this guy really misunderstood. And of course, the eternal question about Karl Marx is, did he in fact have a neck, or did his head just come straight out of the beard? He was a mess. He had a family. He got his doctorate at a diploma mill. He read, like a lot of these guys, he read the people who came before him. So Marx lives at a time when workers have no rights. This is the Industrial Revolution. You have children chained to factory floors. You have, you could get shot for joining a union. So the Industrial Revolution was not working out very well for everybody. And so Marx and his partner, Friedrich Engels, who was himself a capitalist, his family owned a big mill in Great Britain. They argued that people should be equal, and that the economy should be divided in such a way that everybody gets what they need. And his famous phrase, from each according to their ability, to everyone according to their need. So he's a very actually perceptive observer of his own time. And the way Marx describes the government and the economy that he observes is really quite spot on. He doesn't leave much of a prescription. He simply says, well, we're going to have a state run by the workers, and then we shall have, in his famous phrase, a dictatorship of the proletariat, because people will need to be taught that capitalism isn't actually good for them. And he's pretty vague on all of that. So by the time we get to Vladimir Lenin, he's got to pretty much invent it, because Marx hasn't left much of a prescription. So Plato, he's not in terms of creating a system, but he was really rather perceptive about what he observed. And and not a bad read, not a bad read. Now, this is perhaps the most famous graffito in all of political philosophy. Since Nietzsche said God is dead, and then God replies, Nietzsche is dead. So Nietzsche is interesting.
One of the colleges around here?
Yeah.
Oh.
Nietzsche looks at life and says something's not right here. And he's a very interesting writer. His comes across as a bit of a misogynist, and that's not good. So to get anything, when I was reading all these people in college, I tended to say, what can I take away from this, instead of focusing on, well, that doesn't work, right? You dispense with that. Think about what's good. Nietzsche's father, whom he adored, who was a Lutheran minister, got brain cancer and died, and Nietzsche is crushed. And he wonders how this can happen. And so in a series of quite a lot that he wrote, he talks about sort of what he calls the will to power. And he says, in essence, really, we don't have to be sheep. Okay. We don't have to sit back and let whomever oppress us. We can, be who we should be and be all that we should be. He became very mentally ill, unfortunately, and he was taken in by his sister and his brother-in-law, and they were anti-Semites, and so they published all this anti-Jewish stuff under Nietzsche's byline, so to speak, stuff that he never talked about. And so ultimately the Nazis cottoned onto that, and Nietzsche became, some of the things he said, they sort of tried to use, about Aryan supremacy. I mean, Nietzsche in one place writes about the blonde beast, and he's really talking about a human spirit as opposed to an actual Viking killing people. He himself was a short, dark-haired guy. He was not the blonde beast, but raises some questions, which leads us to this guy, Max Weber, who, unsmiling like a lot of people, he's considered the father of modern sociology. He was German, like Nietzsche, had some exposure to war and decided, you know what, this is a really bad idea. And Weber is famous for a couple of things. So he suggests that when we, as Nietzsche had noted, had done away with religion as the driving force in our life, and he's not suggesting that we go back there, but he says, look, we have demystified the world. There is no magic left. So what do we have? What do we have left over based on what we now believe? Making money and having a big house are not bad things, but they're not sort of very spiritually comforting, are they? The other thing Weber is famous for, and the work sort of says it all, Protestantism and capitalism and the Protestant ethic. And this is what makes him a sociologist, but also makes him quite interesting. And he says, look, when sort of we got Calvinist Protestantism, which is Baptists and in that sort of direction of Christianity, and I'm not making any comment about the virtues or potential shortcomings of any of this. He just says, look, this is what happened, and indeed we know that parts of the world that are of certain approaches to life, certain kinds of faith, tend to be wealthier than those which are all sort of say, oh, it's all in God's hands. And I'm not saying you should think that or not. But so under Calvinism, which was named for a Swiss guy named Jean Calvin, who had been sort of the theocratic ruler of Geneva way back in the 16th century. He was apparently pretty severe. But in any case, the thought of Calvinism was what was called predestination. And only some people were going to heaven, and if you were one of the chosen, you would know it. And the way you would know it was sort of the way you would live. And so how you were supposed to live was to work hard. And in working hard, you would probably make more money. But to be a good Christian, according to Calvin, you were not supposed to live ostentatiously. So here you are making more money. So what are you going to do with this extra money? Well, you reinvest it and you make even more money. And this becomes clear that you are indeed predestined to go to heaven. And so Weber, in a pretty interesting chain of thought, works out that this, in fact, had what made capitalism what it is by making a virtue out of making more money. And this becomes, in essence, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Weber, like a lot of these people, was a little bit off his rocker. He was a professor in Germany, and he had years and years where he didn't get any work done. He wouldn't get out of bed. He would sit in a chair and stare at his toes. He attempted to resign his position several times. He realized, I'm not well, I'm not getting any work done, but they were so wowed by him. They said, no, you get to keep your position. Not whom Weber State University was named for, in case you had any doubts there. So anyway, the overall point is that the stuff they were talking about is still the stuff that we are talking about today. We have the form of government that we have, in large part because these people had this conversation stretching over thousands of years. There's not much new under the sun. So anyway, questions? What do you want to talk about today? Now that you've had your lesson, tell me what you think. Tell me what you want to know about. Let's tell each other harmless lies and then laugh. Huh? No question. Yes, Suzanne.
Yes. Which of these philosophies do you feel is preeminent in our present national government?
Well, I think our government, can easily stretch its, its pedigree reaches back to Aristotle, because he's the first guy who said you need a balance of power. You can't have a philosopher king. That's not going to happen. If you have one group of people in power, they will get carried away. That is human nature. So he's when you read him, he's very aristocratic. He doesn't think much of the common people, but he sort of begrudgingly says, well, collectively, they're probably less dumb than they would be otherwise. Aristotle's blessing and misfortune at the same time was to get, he became the tutor of Alexander the Great. And so when the Greeks sort of reclaimed temporarily their independence from the remnants of Alexander's many stepchild empires, Aristotle had to leave town because he was affiliated with the Macedonians, and so he was not popular at that point. So Plato went off to Syracuse, which was a Greek city-state colony in Sicily. The town's still there, and the king of Sicily sort of said, well, you could come here and try out your ideas. But as soon as he realized what Plato was on about, he threw him in jail, which he eventually escaped from. It's dangerous work, I tell you, being a political philosopher. Other questions? Yeah, Joe. You gotta unmute yourself there, Joe.
Thank you. Did Machiavelli ever rule anywhere?
No. Like I said, he was sort of Secretary of State and Defense Secretary for the Florentine Republic, and he organized an army and he engaged on many diplomatic missions, and then a French king with a big army with lots of large cannons came down, and Machiavelli's citizen militia sort of fell apart, and they put the Medici back in power, and Machiavelli was accused of conspiring to assassinate one of the Medici, which was undoubtedly not true. So he was arrested. He was an attorney, and he was tortured, and they one of the things they would do is tie your arms behind your back and tie a rope to that and lift you up by your arms behind your back and then drop you. And apparently Machiavelli, being Machiavelli and being an attorney, is arguing with the torturer that there is a limit to the height to which they can raise him. But he survives this and retires to his country villa where he drinks and plays dice with the country boys, which he does not enjoy at all. But while he's there, he has time to write, and so he writes The Prince and a number of other things. He wrote a couple of plays, one of which I've seen. It's just hilarious, and he's a true Renaissance man. Wrote some histories. I gather they're sketchy. It's not clear that he was entirely accurate about those things. He wrote another famous book called The Art of War. He's not regarded as a great military scholar, and it's no fun to read because he decided he would write it in dialogues like Plato, and I can't stand that. But The Prince and the Discourses are actually quite interesting, and a small man, not a big guy, but a big brain. His hero in The Prince is Cesare de Borgia, whose father was the Pope. There's been lots of TV series made about them. I have since read a book that argues that all of this is hoo-ha because winners write history. And Machiavelli points out that in the places where de Borgia ruled, he's attempting to sort of carve a state out of Italy with the help of his father, the Pope. The places where he ruled, he was quite popular because he established just and good government, but he would do things like this. He sends this one henchman into this town and he treats everybody badly, and de Borgia shows up and has the guy publicly put to death, and now he's a hero because he saved the people from the bad man that he sent there in the first place. And this gets back to sort of Machiavelli's point of, he has this whole section in The Prince, is it better to be feared or loved? And he said, well, it's better to be feared because people are less likely to try to kill you then. So I've just always found him quite fascinating and generally misunderstood. So, he's trying to convince somebody, if you take these steps, we could unite Italy and then we wouldn't be a playground for armies anymore. So other questions?
I could see a final exam where you might ask, discuss the happy political philosophers. I wonder if we could jump ahead 50 years and look back on the last 50 years of presidents.
Yeah.
Who you would think might be happy.
Yeah. Well, I stopped with Weber because after that, political theory gets a whole lot less interesting. So, for example, there's I tell my students, don't do this. So when I was in graduate school and we all had to present on some school of political thought, it was a philosophy of social science research course, which I really enjoyed, but this is pre-internet. So you actually had to read stuff. And I remember one of my classmates choosing Marx, and I thought, well, why would you do that? We all know about Marx. Well, the reason you do that is because you don't then have to reinvent the wheel. And I chose what's called critical theory. And because I thought that sounded interesting. The leading light of critical theory was a German guy named Jürgen Habermas, so a 20th century guy. And to this day, I do not know, was Habermas that bad of a writer, or was his translator simply that inept? And I suspect it's some of both. But in any case, I was working nights at a newspaper and I kept putting this off. And then the day before I had to do my presentation, I thought, if I don't do this, I do not pass the class and I will not get my degree. And that was not going to happen. So I got home from work about midnight and I got out the book and I read and I took some notes. And after about 45 minutes, I got really tired. So I set my alarm for 30 minutes and took a nap and woke up and read some more. And I did this back and forth all night long. And I got there in the morning and then my class was not till the afternoon. And I made my presentation, and I remember my professor, one of his criticisms was, you didn't pause for questions. And I thought if I'd have paused, I'd have keeled over. So I tell my younger students now, do not be like me. Do not wait until the last minute to prepare this. If you have a paper to write, get to work on it now. I don't know how much they listen, but in any case, I can sum up critical theory in a light bulb joke. This gets big laughs in political science circles, but in any case, how many light bulbs does it take? How many critical theorists does it take to screw in a light bulb? It only takes one, but first he has to sit in a darkened room and determine whether light is something he really needs or if it's just something that's been culturally imposed upon him. So that's critical theory in a nutshell. The idea being that you have to have an ideal speech situation in which we can understand each other, and if we can ever get to that point, perhaps we can figure out what we would do. Now, Habermas, being a Marxist, his thought always was that, well, and if we do this, we'll all become Marxists, which I think is a bit of a supposition. Marxists I've known have time and again said, oh, it doesn't have to be like that, but it's like, it always is. If there is no check upon the power of the state ultimately will oppress the people. And that's the problem with what I call the authoritarian model, which begins with Plato. There's I think an authoritarian model. Some people are smart enough to be in charge and some are not. There's the democratic model, which says people should get to participate. And then the third model would be the anarchic model. And these are people who argue that, in fact, the problem is government, that the state always gets used as an engine of repression. And so what we need is in essence, the least amount of government possible. So they're not really libertarians who believe in some tiny slice of government, but you would have, like, you would be ruled by a neighborhood council of which you would be a member. And their assumption seems to be that life would go on pretty much as we know it without the repression. And I'm not convinced that that's true, because it's like people getting their vaccinations, right? It doesn't take many to sort of spread COVID some more. So if they haven't been vaccinated, different topic, of course. Other questions? Thank you, Ray. That was a good question.
Is that Marty there with the blue?
I don't think so. Yeah,
All righty.
I don't think so.
Doug, are we up next month then?
We are
We're on the calendar?
live in Judson Parks Chapel next month.
Oh,
Martha.
well, it'll be hard not to run around and hug you all after seeing you.
I know.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm open to suggestions as to what you might want to hear about. So you can
Right.
reach out to me, reach out to Doug,
Um,
and let me know what you want to hear about. Give me time to put it together.
That means get me the information as soon as you can, and don't be shy like I know you all are.
I think that just means they're smart. They're smart enough not to say
Yes, they
foolish
are.
things, right? Yeah.
Thank you, TM.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to be
Thank
with you.
you.
Be well. Stay safe out there. See you in a month live.
All right.
You're on.
Okay. Very good.